You're listening to the Saving Elephants podcast, a place where millennials express and defend their conservative values in hopes of restoring the Republican Party. Join us as we reignite conservatism for millennials.
Last month, the Saving Elephants podcast turned 7 years old. I cannot believe it has been 7 years since the first episode of this podcast dropped. One of my first guests back in those days was Destry Edwards. And it has been nearly 7 years since he was last on the podcast, but I'm happy he's rejoining me in this episode to talk about a documentary he's been working on for some time, Dear Mr. President, The Letters of Julia Sann. It's the story of how this one individual, Julia Sann, influenced former President Chester A. Arthur, and as a result impacted our entire political system. Now, 7 years ago, when I last checked in with Destry, he was an independent podcaster, but he has been busy since then, working for a season for The Blaze Media and FreedomWorks before it was tragically defunct. And these days he works for the Competitive Enterprise Institute, CEI, where he pursues his passions for both film and politics. If you're interested in seeing the full documentary, I of course will link to that information in the show notes. But with that, I give you my conversation with Destry Edwards.
You're listening to the Saving Elephants show.
So I want to get into who was Julia, who was Chester A. Arthur, but let me just sort of let you set the tone for us. What is this all about, and why are you hoping people will watch this, and what would they get out of it?
Sure. I mean, I imagine most people in the country are not hugely familiar with President Chester Arthur. They might know he exists, maybe, or existed, potentially. That might be all, and they might know about his mutton chop sideburns. But beyond that, he's kind of a pretty unknown figure in American history. And, you know, some people kind of deserve obscurity. But as you dig into the story of Chester Arthur, how he became president, what he did as president, and as our story especially focuses on this average citizen from New York who influenced his administration and influenced what he did, it's a story that really calls for our attention and it has some important things to tell us.
Yeah, so, and I want to get into, I think I looked up, it depends on which survey you look up. Chester A. Arthur is usually listed among the most forgettable or not remembered presidents, which is not a bad place to be. You certainly don't want to be with your James Buchanans or those who are the most reviled or hated presidents. You know, but he's usually listed with the Franklin Pierce or the Millard Fillmore. It's almost more a trivia question. I obviously want to spend a bit of time unpackaging who Arthur was, why he was important, what it may mean for us today. But let's talk about Julia Sann first. She's just an average citizen, but what is this role she's playing in this film? Because these are about the letters that she's written to the president. So who was Julia Sann?
Yeah, so Julia Sann, she was the daughter of an immigrant. She was her mother was a native-born American, and her father was an immigrant from Germany. And she was the last of 8 children. They were a fairly wealthy family. The father had passed away by this point. She was living with her brother in New York City, not far from Central Park. But she was unmarried. She had illnesses. We don't know entirely what all those illnesses were, but it kept her in the house for a lot of the time and certainly kept her in bed for some time as well.
Well, eventually, if I'm not mistaken, leads her to a psych ward. Yeah,
not necessarily her ailments, although that might have been part of it. We don't know all the details specifically. But yeah, she was a fairly reclusive woman, but she was a very intelligent woman and a woman who cared a lot about what was going on in her country at the time.
And what was going on in her country at the time? Of course, this is Chester A. Arthur as president in sort of the post-Civil War era. This is when the Republican Party, for obvious reasons, has dominated American politics. James Garfield was the individual elected president, the guy who was supposed to be president. James Garfield, of course, is assassinated, and I don't know the number of times we do this. Obviously, vice presidents to a certain degree are selected on their political clout or the ability to help the ticket win. But it does seem to me that there's this bizarre repeat in American history of you select a guy to be vice president, expecting and hoping he will never be president, and history throws you a curveball. I mean, the same thing happened with Theodore Roosevelt. I can't remember who the McKinley's cabinet secretary says, well, now that damn president's going to be or that damn cowboy is going to be our president now. we see this over and over. He was never supposed to be president. He was not really somebody that was terribly chummy with James Garfield. He was not somebody that had necessarily a good relationship with him. But tell us about at the time, the Republican Party, maybe there are many, many factions, but it looked to me as if James Garfield and Chester Arthur almost represented two different factions within the broader Republican Party at that time.
Yeah, that's right. As you alluded to, the Republican Party was very powerful in American politics at that time. Something I like to point out to people is that between Abraham Lincoln in 1860 and William Howard Taft in 1912, there was only one Republican nominee for president who never served as president. And you didn't have any Democrats elected president. I say elected because we have Andrew Johnson. But as far as elected president, we don't have any Democrats between James Buchanan in 1856 and Grover Cleveland in 1884. That's a pretty big gap.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was a system that was started under the Democrats, under Jackson specifically, called the spoils system, where basically the government jobs were handed out to people not based on if they had merit or if they were qualified to do their jobs, but if they had supported the ticket, if they had supported the party and they were loyal to the party, you get a job. Congratulations. And so in the time, particularly after the Civil War, that was the Republican Party because they had so much control. You had all these Republican machines around the country, and New York City was certainly one of the biggest ones. And Chester Arthur was one of the leaders in that. Senator Roscoe Conkling was the leader, and Arthur is one of his top lieutenants and ran the New York City Custom House for a long time as the collector there, which was the most prominent of all the patronage positions you could get in the spoils system. And they were what you would call the stalwart branch of the Republican Party. And then you had the other side, which looked at all this and said, hey, this isn't how government should be run. This isn't how we serve the American people with our government. We need to actually have people who are in these positions based on their qualifications for the job rather than who they're loyal to. And that side of the party was called the half-breeds, which you can imagine was named by the other side because they saw them as basically half Republicans because they didn't want to give them the jobs that they wanted. And so James Garfield represented that wing of the party. He was actually only moderately a half-breed when he got the nomination for the presidency in 1880, but as the campaign went on and he saw the corruption of the stalwarts, he actually became more and more strongly aligned with that side of things. And then Arthur was put on the ticket from the stalwart faction because they needed New York City or New York State in order to win the election. And so they just look at this Roscoe Conkling, Arthur's boss, and say, hey, we need to grab one of his people, put him on the ticket, so that way Conkling and the New York City machine will help support this ticket in 1880. They're not interested in Arthur ever being president, but that's how he's picked for that. And you have these two very different people, Garfield and Arthur, on the ticket together. And it's supposed to be for Garfield, but Arthur is kind of waiting in the wings unexpectedly for everybody. And you alluded to putting people on the ticket, hoping that they never become president. One of the more famous cartoons of Chester Arthur, if there is such a category, is you have Arthur on one end of the cartoon, you have all of Garfield's cabinet on the other end of the cartoon looking at him with skepticism. And if you look in the background, you see paintings and frames of these other vice presidents who became president. We're talking like John Tyler and Fillmore and Johnson. And you see these frames for these people in the background, and all of them have a note on them that lists them as like failure or something like that.
Yeah, let's say that list. Fillmore, Tyler, you don't want to be in that list.
Yeah. Every single vice president who had ever come to the presidency through a president's death, every single one of them had been a failure and detested by both the political class as well as the people. Mm-hmm. And there was no reason, especially with Arthur's background from the stalwart faction, of this background of corruption that he had been thrown out by the former president, Rutherford B. Hayes. He had been kicked out of the collector job because of his corruption. And so there was no reason for anybody to think that he was going to be any different from these other vice presidents who came to the presidency.
I just want to clarify there because Rutherford B. Hayes is probably somebody else that winds up in a trivia quiz of
Sure.
obscure
Yeah.
American presidents. Chester A. Arthur was removed from a lofty position in the Republican machine by a Republican president due to his corruption. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah. Hayes was he's not necessarily remembered fondly from those who do remember him today because of the questions around that election cycle
Right.
in 1876. But Hayes was a want-to-be reformer, and he just didn't have a party that was willing to back him up at the time. But he did remove Chester Arthur from the collector of the Port of New York position because he was just so corrupt in what he was doing there.
So let me back us up for just a hair, and there may simply be no succinct answer here, but I'm curious, how do we get from the spoil system being something that was honed and perfected by Jackson or Jacksonian Democrats, right, pre-Civil War? Abraham Lincoln was no fan of Andrew Jackson. How does that spoil system eventually seep into the Republican Party?
So I don't think it's a Republican values versus Democratic values concept. I think it's more of that's where the power was. As we already discussed, the Republican Party had so much power in that post-war era, and the government was growing after the Civil War. Washington was getting bigger, and people who wanted to be involved and you need people behind you, you need people supporting you to be able to get office. And that concept was already there from the Democratic Party, the spoil system. And so I think it just kind of naturally, that just kind of became the factor on the Republican side to kind of help grow the system. It wasn't, and the Democrats tended to be the reformers for civil service at that time in American history, but it wasn't because the Democratic Party was necessarily more noble in any kind of sense. It was just because they didn't have the power.
Mm-hmm.
It was the Republicans had all the power. And so the people who without the power wanted to reform it.
Yeah, and that makes sense. I think it can be difficult for us to appreciate being this far removed from it, the degree to which this sort of pay-to-play scheme had such a stranglehold in politics, right? This is depicted oftentimes in movies of that era, that you would have your party bosses who themselves would control local governments, who could move on up the chain and eventually get somebody into the presidency with the understanding that it would trickle back down, that there would be some sort of windfall. So it was sort of it was this just rife with corruption from top to bottom, right? We do see things like this these days. Something that, as a people, Americans might be able to agree it would be better for the country if this. But you can also see how the political class, Democrat or Republican, benefit from the status quo, and therefore it's difficult to truly reform something.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. It's not everyone in politics, unfortunately, has the goal of going into it with how can we serve the American people? How can we serve the country? A lot of it is just, hey, I'm just trying to get ahead.
James Garfield, relatively shortly into his administration, is shot, and shot, ironically, by Charles Guiteau, if I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Yes.
His assassin, who's probably not mentally all there, but makes it known, I'm killing the president because his replacement, Arthur, is going to get me the job I deserve.
Yeah, so Garfield serves the second shortest presidential stint in history so far, just after the famous William Henry Harrison with his 1 month. Garfield, I think it's 4 months he serves as president. Charles Guiteau is a stalwart who did support the ticket of Garfield during that election and expected to get some spoils as a reward. He specifically wanted to be ambassador to France or ambassador to Austria. And, he was not qualified for these jobs. And honestly, even under a stalwart president, I don't think he would have gotten those jobs. He was just a nobody. But he tries to get under Garfield, gets rejected several times. And so he gets in his head, well, if I shoot Garfield, then Arthur will become president, and I can get one of these jobs. And also, this is for the good of the country in his mind, that we make the spoil system powerful again, because Garfield was showing very early in his term already that he was going to be fighting against the spoil system. So in his mind, he's doing this for himself, but also for the country and for the party. And he says as much in the letters that he wrote afterwards, or in preparation for this. He kind of writes a letter that he keeps on his person when he shoots Garfield, so they can take that letter when they take him into custody. And so this, as you can imagine, he says that I'm a stalwart and Arthur will be president. And as you can imagine, that really puts a lot of pressure on Arthur and the entire machine, that the guy who just shot the president of the United States is saying he's doing it because I'm on this team and I like this person. That's not a good position for anybody to walk into.
At the very least, it's very awkward to walk into. So, yeah, I'm obviously the assassin was a loose cannon, a bit of a loose screw, and he would not be the individual to uphold to try to examine an argument. But the stalwarts were an entire faction within the Republican Party, and I suspect many of them went to sleep at night thinking they were doing what was best for the country. They were not necessarily just, I'm assuming, conniving, evil, saying, well, it's just corruption, I just want to be part of the deal. Like that. Certainly you have to convince yourself first before you can start to convince other people. So I'm just curious, can you still man for me? What would the stalwarts' case have been for the spoils system? Why, in their mind, is this actually good for the United States?
I mean, sure. I think from their perspective, their thought would be, this is what you need to do in order to have the staffing for government, and you're just realistically not going to be able to make a government work any other way. This is how jobs work. We're still being able to do good for the country in this position. But if you're going to have a party that is functioning and can actually do the things a party needs to be able to do to make an organization run, this is just how it has to work. And frankly, again, this was not a new concept that started after the Civil War. This has been going since Jackson, which at that point was the majority of the country's history. Like it was kind of how it was done. Like I don't think that they would have looked at it. And today we can look at what they did and we can call it corruption. I think that's a correct term, but I can totally see where, from their perspective, they wouldn't have thought about it as corruption at that time, and would be offended by that term.
Yeah, it's also such a the New Deal era and FDR so distorts our politics that there's a difference in degree that results in difference in kind, right? Between what was it back then? The GDP, the federal budget took up 3% of the GDP or something less than that. That and I'm not saying that you can't have corruption. Absolutely, we did since the founding of the country with Hamilton and speculations and stuff. To be clear, Alexander Hamilton was not responsible or leading the corruption, but he kind of turned a blind eye when people beneath him were involved in it. But it does seem that it makes it at times difficult to have comparative conversations because we're talking about something that is much less the behemoth it is today. I can't even imagine a true spoils system with the current size of the federal government. It seems like it would almost cease to be any sort of, gosh, I don't even know what that would be like to have that many individuals put into positions not because of their worth or value, but because of what they can bring politically to the table.
Yeah, I mean, as many problems as we can see in government today, and we could name off many for the entire episode, it would be certainly worse if this was the system that was driving things.
So Chester A. Arthur, and as it's pointed out in the video, unlike many of the other presidents who have died while in office, Garfield hangs on for a while. So Arthur and the entire nation has a long time for it to settle in. Something's about to change here. We don't know when exactly, but it does in fact look like Arthur's the next president. I would describe him as an incredibly reluctant president, one that was not expecting nor desired to step into this role, and certainly not under these circumstances. And he steps into this position, and this is when, of course, Julia Sand, who we talked about at the beginning of the conversation, makes her appearance in the story. So what is Julia Sand's impact on Chester Arthur in this very shaky time for him?
Yeah, I think the term reluctant is generous. Like, he very much did not want to be the president. This was not a job. Like, he was interested in being a vice president. It was a job where, it looks good on a resume. It looks good in the history books. Vice presidents we do remember. We don't remember many from that time. But it would be, something illustrious, and he wouldn't have to do anything. He did not want to be the president. And Julia Sand actually writes her first letter to Chester Arthur before Garfield has actually passed. He's about probably a month away from passing at that point. It takes a couple months for him to ultimately die from from all of this, which is a fascinating story in itself, but not one that we focus on in this documentary. So Julia writes to him. She starts off the letter acknowledging the position that the country is in, and she says to him that the people are bowed in grief, but do you realize it? Not so much because he is dying, but because you are his successor. And that's kind of a bit of a gut punch for anybody reading that, I think. And I think he knew that was true, certainly to an extent. Like, certainly people were mourning the position Garfield was in, but also nobody wanted Chester Arthur to be president, including himself. And so she continues on for a while, pointing out how much the country does not want him to be president, how much even other people in politics did not want him to be president. But then she tells him, like, hey, you can actually rise above this. You can prove people wrong. She says that he can reform, that he can rise to the emergency, that he can disappoint their fears, and that she encourages him to force the nation to have faith in you. So she doesn't pull punches in recognizing where things are, but then also encourages him to rise above it. And that's something that is unusual to see, frankly, in politics.
And to be clear, this is this was the initial letter, but these are a series of letters, not correspondence. Arthur didn't write her back that we know of anyways, but she is sending him her thoughts. I mean, constituents do that today in flaming emails with a lot of half-truths and things they read on social media. But it seemed like this was, first of all, in an era where you could probably do this and hope to get the presidency, or much more likely, but also these letters were written in good faith, and at precisely the moment he needed to hear someone speak confidently that they had faith in him, that they had faith in his ability. Now, to be fair, not faith that he would do what was right, but that he was in a position to do what was right. And at that point, of course, now we're talking about civil service reform. Now, we mentioned that phrase a couple of times, but what civil service reform kind of has a bad taste in its mouth to conservatives today, and I do want to get into that. But like at this moment, what is civil service reform?
Yeah, so civil service reform, as people were talking about it there in the 1870s and 1880s, was basically what we can do to reform the spoil system that we've been talking about. How can we make it to where government jobs are not politically based, how they're not about who was loyal to who, but about who's qualified for these jobs and who's going to actually do a good job for the country and for the people, rather than just, I'm here because it suits my purposes.
And that makes sense. And so, and a name we've mentioned already, Senator Conkling, was, I guess you could say what would you call it? He was the head of the stalwart movement, or he was seen as the number one guy in charge of the spoil system, or at least supportive of the spoil system?
Yeah, so he was certainly the leader of the Republican Party machine in New York State at that time in history. And I think nationally, it's fair to say, I think he was also ultimately the leader of that faction of the party as well. Party factions can often have different figureheads. It's not a clear elected, here is the leader, but right. I think it's fair to say he held that position as well.
And he expects, for probably good reason, now that Arthur is president, I'm going to get some sort of windfall for this. And to put it bluntly, is very disappointed in Arthur's response. And what I find interesting, I do want to get to this, is not only does Arthur alienate the stalwart faction by denying them access to the spoil system and ultimately pushing through civil service reform, but interestingly, it appears he was, I don't know if hated and vilified is the right way, but at the very least, very much not trusted by the other side. Like, whoa. This guy was the head of the snake. This was the guy that former President Hayes literally had to get out because of his corruption. Why would we ever trust or work with this guy?
Yeah, and that's the problem that he was coming to as he came to his reelection prospects. But you're right. The machine people, they looked at him and said, "Hey, you've actually been the worst president for us in our lifetimes. Like, you were of us, and yet you're the one who's taking away all of our stuff, taking away all of our ability to run our machine the way we've been doing." But then the reformers look at Arthur and say, "You're the guy who's been one of the leading people against us for the past decade or so, and even though you are working with us to an extent now in helping us pass civil service reform, forgive us for not trusting you for what you've done in the past 3 years, because we already have our own leaders of our faction that we already like.
Right.
And we already trust our own people. And so we appreciate what you've done. But as we go into a new election cycle, we kind of already have our bench.
Yeah, which is why, I mean, I'm skipping ahead a bit, but ultimately he does not secure, does he even seek the party's renomination?
Sort of. So he is definitely open to it, and he lets his name be put out there. But as that time was approaching, people would come to his office and would tell him, hey, you've been great. I'm happy to support you. But I want such and such position in your next administration. And he tells all of them, no, I'm not promising you anything. And so his people also, they want to go to the convention and promote him at the convention. And he tells them, no, stay here, do your job here. And that kind of surprises them. So he tells people, I'm open to taking it, but he's not willing to basically be a machine politician in order to get it. He's not making those kinds of promises anymore. He's not doing a machine system to get the nomination. And so with all these factors involved, he does not get the nomination for 1884.
I can see why certain libertarians are a big fan of Arthur.
Indeed.
So I want to ask about civil, because I tease this out, civil service reform. I think we can understand the machine politics of this era, why it would be needed, why, if the federal government is just a pinprick size of what it is today, it actually makes a lot of sense. Do you hire someone not because of political loyalty or ideology or adherence to some, say, system of either limited government or expanding the government to, air quotes, help people, but you do so because of their qualifications? What goes wrong? Because today, those are the exact arguments that conservatives are facing when they're trying to say, look, you can never fire someone from the government, even if they're clearly an ideologue, even if it's clear they're not bringing value. We have created a professional class. And the idea of America was supposed to be we're represented, we elect individuals. And sure, there's always going to be an administration, there's always going to be staff and some sense of unelected. But at this point, are the bureaucracies running the country and Congress is more a figurehead? So how do we morph from this era where civil service reform not only makes sense, it's actually a collective good, to it may be the very thing standing in the way of reform?
Yeah, so I think for good civil service, there are kind of three things that are important. You want to be based on merit. You want people to be safe from political pressures, but you also want people to be accountable. And throughout our history, we seem to struggle to get all three of those at the same time. So as we've been talking about in this system during the Arthur era, there were some big problems with merit. But now today you see more problems with accountability. And that starts to come more into play, not under Arthur, but those problems come into play during the Wilson administration, where he starts to grow bureaucracy within the executive branch and kind of blur the lines between executive, legislative, and judicial, and kind of just do everything within these bureaucracies. And then, of course, under FDR, that explodes even more to where the bureaucracies are kind of running everything they can get their hands on. And at that point, you're then also insulating them from political pressures, yes, but also from political oversight and a political accountability. And so that's where you start to see you're kind of shifting these different value sets on here, and you wind up with more of what we have today.
It's probably fair to visit for a moment, at least under, you could say the same of FDR, but certainly under Wilson, that the expanse of the federal power was the point, right? It was very much and I want to try to do it. It's fun to pick on Woodrow Wilson.
Always.
The guy was not only a horrible person, but extreme racist, even by the standards of the day, and frankly, probably the worst or one of the worst presidents we've ever had. It's hard to knock Buchanan off of that pedestal, but the expanse of the federal bureaucracy was the point for the simple reason that the belief was among progressives, or at least the Wilsonian progressives at the time, that politics was a science in effect. That yes, what the founders had set up for us was good in its day, but we've almost outgrown that because we have become so sophisticated. The country's become so sophisticated. and our means of technology, our education is so much above and beyond what it would have been back then that we actually now have the ability to put the right people in positions to solve a problem, right? So we want a professional class running the country, because why would this possibly ever go awry, right? Because they're only in it to do what's good and what's right. And of course, I can certainly understand if you're coming out of an era where you've got a spoil system, where you've got, I'm blanking on the guy's name, but we know that all Americans were paying a slightly higher price for sugar because of one senator, to the effect because he had his hand in the cookie jar, no pun intended, with the sugar industry. I can understand a desire for, as they would describe it, progress. Let's move beyond these sort of petty political fights and let's actually do the right thing for the American people. How? By putting the professional in charge. And it occurred to me, I don't know that there's even a question here. I'm just sort of monologuing, but is that a fair summation of what sort of kicks off this thing that eventually becomes where civil service becomes more the enemy of reform rather than the tool of reform?
Yeah, I think the big thing is you're probably actually giving Wilson too much credit there. In his paper might be the wrong term, but what he wrote called The Study of Administration back when he was a college professor, which I think was also 1880s. He's not very fond of the Constitution. He actually says that the Constitution has delayed us from getting to the place where we need to be as far as how the government runs. So when he finally got into the presidency, it was very much his intention to move away from the separation of powers that we had and kind of just keep it all within the executive branch doing everything with these bureaucracies, with these professional bureaucracies. And so that does create a chasm from accountability there that is something we need to continue looking to correct. And civil service reform, I think as a term, I think it's worth reclaiming that, frankly, because what we need today as well is still civil service reform, not in the way that someone like Wilson would have looked at it, and also not entirely the way that someone like Arthur would have looked at it, because it is a different time. We can't just do exactly what Arthur did and call that's what we need to be at this point. But civil service was good at one point, and we need to make civil service good again with the kind of reforms we can put in place now where we do make accountability more of a factor in all of this.
I want to ask you, because I think there's a lot of lessons embedded in this about human nature. You mentioned earlier Julius Sands calls Arthur to rise above, and I want to explore that in a minute. But I'm thinking first about, there's a strong tendency in the United States, and maybe this is true of any free people, I don't know, but to have this sort of idea in mind that if we could just get Mr. Smith to go to Washington, we could fix things. I'm referring, of course, to the movie in which well, to be frank, I hadn't even seen the movie.
Well, it's a great movie.
I know it's a classic. I didn't need to get around to seeing it, but that essentially Jimmy Stewart's character goes to Washington, filibusters, and it's kind of this notion of if we could just get the average yokel his voice heard in the halls of Congress, he would have what is in the best interest of the country at large, because everybody in Congress does not have what's in the best interest of the country. And I think to a degree, Jonah Goldberg always talks about poison is determined by its dosage. A degree of populism, I think, is a very good thing. I think it brings with it a necessary cynicism or distrust of central authorities. But I think it can be bad in that it sort of has this idea in mind that all that is necessary for us to get this right is just to get the right people in. And the right people are almost always sort of a certain class of people. Usually almost always the ones that the person happens to be in at the time. I'm saying all this to say that in a weird way, and I know that Chester A. Arthur was probably in no sense a populist per se, especially given his upbringing. But in a weird way, it seems to me that Arthur's story is almost an example of this working. You have someone who is, become part of the machine so that you can reform the machine. I mean, he's deeply embedded in this, and who could have possibly predicted? I don't think anybody had on their bingo card, this was the guy that's going to get behind ushering some civil service reform. And I'm trying to think of this in comparison to today. I don't want to get too far out there and try to draw parallels, but the thing that springs to mind is in the 2016 Republican National Convention, Trump's famous lines, "I alone can fix it." What he said before that was he was using it as an example. Well, I don't remember his exact words, but things to the effect of, well, sure, I've kind of skirted around, taxes, if you will. I've taken advantage of the system. I've played by these crooked rules. I know these crooked rules. These are my words, not his. But for that reason, I'm the only person who can fix the system because I'm part of the system, and I mean to do good. Trump is not the only person who's promised this. But I dare say the vast majority of people who are part of, air quotes, the system and claim, hey, now that I've been so embedded in this, I'm suddenly going to turn over a new leaf and do good things, that almost never works. And so I'm just curious, is there a danger in learning the lesson of Arthur? That, well, yeah, obviously could work sometimes, but that this is not something we ordinarily should expect to do anything other than go awry.
I mean, that's a good question. Certainly worth pointing out that that was never Arthur's selling point. He never said, hey, I've been part of the machine, but you elect me, I will dismantle this.
Fair enough.
He came into office, as we've discussed, very much not intentionally to do any of that. That was never a selling point for him. I think ultimately you caught the wrong person at the right time and with the right influences on him. Certainly, we highlight in the documentary the influence of Julia Sand, and you mentioned she never wrote back to him, or he never wrote back to her, which is true. We do have reason we talk about in the documentary as to why we know that he did read the letters. We can get into that or not as you decide, but we do know that he read the letters. So he had influences from that, certainly had influences from just the circumstances of how Garfield was killed. And so you pile on these things that were not planned for in the election onto a human being who is now president of the United States, and that changes things in a way that you don't necessarily expect and you don't campaign on. As far as the populism, I think you could get that impression of Julia Sand as a populist in possibly from the documentary and also just the general story.
Mm-hmm.
There's actually a letter from her that we don't mention in the documentary because it's off track of what we're focused on. But actually one of my favorite letters that she wrote is her 10th letter, where she is encouraging Arthur so there had been a prison guard who had actually taken a shot at Charles Guiteau while Guiteau was imprisoned and missed. He didn't kill the guy, or he didn't kill Guiteau. But so this guard, of course, was then arrested himself and was being put on trial. And there was actually a significant call in the country to have this guy pardoned for this guard who tried to kill the assassin, to have him pardoned. And there's actually a petition with 350,000 signatures, which in a country of 50 million people at the time and no internet to sign this petition, that's significant. That was 0.5% of the country had signed this petition that was not online. And Julia Sand wrote to him in this 10th letter and encouraged him not to pardon him because this would be wrong to do. And she gives some fairly eloquent reasoning in her letter and good reasons for it as to why he shouldn't. And then she notes this petition and looks to these, I guess you could call these populists calling for this. And she actually refers to them as both fools and idiots for calling for this, which I think is just again, I wish we could have covered this letter in the documentary, but it is one of my favorite letters of her and does kind of walk away from the populism side of things a little bit.
As you mentioned earlier, Julia Sand certainly pulls no punches in her writing. This was the other aspect I said I was putting a pin in that I wanted to turn to. I think the call to rise above. I think this is desperately missing in our culture today. Again, just because he's the most, he's the example at hand. Donald Trump is, we're both believers, we're both Christians, and it hurts me the degree to which Trump is surrounded by professing Christians. And I'm not talking about his fan base, if you will. I mean those who literally have his ear, who have essentially used that platform to not call him to rise above anything, so far as I could tell. Maybe there are examples I'm just not aware of, but it seems like it's a doubling down of trying to convince him he's doing God's work, just in the position he's in. And again, I want to be cautious here because there's a lot of examples of this. I think asking someone to rise above is something that might be wrong here, but that I think is definitely important for men to hear. And it seems to be a very cynical, cold lack of faith in people that we actually can expect better of people, of our leaders, that we can both hold them to account and love them more at the same time, right? There are plenty of people that want to hold Donald Trump to account and hate the guy. There are very few people, so far as I could tell, that genuinely want what's best for him and think there are ways in which he needs to be held to account. Again, not just Trump. All of our leaders are this way, right? It's easy to loathe, to hate them, to think they're just monsters. They'll never do any better. It's very difficult to do what Julia Sand has done, and what apparently was very rare in her day too, to both call a spade and say, look, most of the country doesn't want you to be president, and acknowledge you have done some bad things, but then to also say in equal breath, I expect you to do better. You can do better. You can lift this weight. This is not so much a Christian message per se, even though I've mentioned some of that, but I think it's more of the founding's vision of civic duties, of civic responsibilities, of civic virtues, that we can, in fact, expect each other to behave in a way that is conducive to good government, not just our leaders, but even the citizens. Again, I don't know if there's a question there. Those are just some thoughts I had in watching this piece. It hurts me the degree to which we so need Julia Sands today in the ears of our leaders.
Yeah, I mean, certainly something we see from Arthur is he apparently had the ability to self-reflect. And I think that's a very important quality for people to have in order to make changes to their behavior and to their actions. And as far as Julia Sand, putting aside the technological differences that are obvious between now and then, but just as far as the mindset, I think it's important to consider that she was not somebody who was, going on Twitter and getting some good knocks on a politician and getting some funny things that people can like and retweet and kind of just building an audience for herself.
Right.
That was not her purpose. She was not there to promote herself. She was not there to get a following. She had a sincere desire to just quietly influence the president of the United States, to quietly influence a person who had some level of power and be honest with him, but also looking out for his good, looking out for his career, and trying to actually be of help to him and not just there to attack him. She gave criticism, and sometimes the criticism may be stated better than she did sometimes, frankly, but ultimately the intention was constructive criticism, and she had his good in mind. And that's something that, frankly, in our political discourse today, it's fairly rare to see.
Yeah, I'm glad you put it that way, because it occurs to me it takes both, right? It takes the individual who offers criticism in good faith. It also takes an individual who has the ability and willingness to listen to that criticism. That doesn't necessarily mean you always have to agree, but it's more of when those two things can meet, I think you can reasonably hope and expect people to rise above their circumstances and behave in a way that's respectable, that's honorable, that's, again, conducive to good government. It's probably worth saying that in a lot of ways, yes, the technology is different. I just think that mindset is so important to grasp, though. Julia Sands is writing letters at some point, is doubting whether or not the president's even reading these, is aware of the fact that she is, she lives in obscurity, right? It's not like she was, nobody was vaunting her as some sort of a hero. It's difficult work to truly try to call someone to be better, because you necessarily have to not do it. Well, let me rephrase that. Sometimes you can do it publicly, but that can never be the point. It can never be about building your brand, your influence, your platform. The instant it's about that, you're in the wrong spirit, and I think most of us can see right through it and don't feel like you're calling us to a better nature, but in fact doing it for your own benefit. That being said, with the technological differences, what would the standard delivery mechanisms be today? And I don't necessarily mean everybody listening to this saying, I'm going to email Donald Trump. But I mean just the person in your life. What would you see as a way in which we can call people to better things and do it in a selfless manner that has nothing to do with building our own influence or worth?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. Certainly things are different today. You write a letter to the president today, you're less likely to have... the president does read some letters that come in from the public, but there's now a whole system in place for that. And if you want the president to read 2 of your letters, good luck. And quick side note, based kind of connected to what you were saying, this is why I kind of hate the idea of open letters, because open letters tend to not be sincere.
Right.
It's really more about, I'm addressing this to this person, but really this is for everyone else to read and kind of promote myself. I'm not saying every open letter is like that. I would say most of them are. Practical ways you can do that today. I think in most situations, not every situation, but in most, it's probably something that is more private. Just because when you're criticizing someone, doing it publicly it's harder for them to take it in a spirit of trying to help than it is otherwise. So in whatever way that seems appropriate, and frankly, as just alluding to, you might have a way to access the president, whether it's the current president, whether it's a president in the future. If you have that way to reach them, that's great. It also might not be the president. It might be the administrator of the EPA. It might be your representative. It might be your mayor. It might be your councilman. It might be the guy who runs the grocery store down the street that you need to influence for one reason or another. And whoever it is that you think you can have a good influence on, whatever method that makes sense for that, whether it's meeting with them, whether it's a phone call, whether it's an email, just the points of be sincere, be honest, but also show them, make it clear to them that you are looking for their good. You're not there to make a point to prop yourself up and put them down, but you are there to help them.
Those are good thoughts. As I say very often in Saving Elephants, that it's who you vote for on election day is far less important than the life you live as far as its impact on the country at large. And I am a firm believer, and I think most of us, if we just reflect on this for a moment, can see, that actually is probably the case. Individuals who have had profound impacts on our lives and have shaped our character and who we are probably had no idea they did that. Maybe some of them were dead before we were born. Maybe some of them knew us but had no idea that they were impacting us in the manner that they were. And your life makes a difference. You actually can have an impact and influence. You can call people to their better nature. You can call people to rise above. That is so much more important than whether or not you got the right box checked, than whether or not you were on team red or team blue.
And quickly on that, you mentioned our civic duty goes beyond voting. This was the 1880s. Julia Sand was not able to vote.
True.
As far as anyone could see, she had no ability to influence anything, and yet she was able to have an influence. We can, from the record, we can know she had an influence on the president of the United States and helped guide the direction he took the country. And so certainly we should be looking far above the ability to go into a voting booth once every couple of years and be engaged in only that way. Certainly we should be engaged no less than that, but we can be engaged more than that.
I would normally just end the conversation here on kind of a high note, but I want to ask you one other brief series of questions, I guess, if I will, on some of your other efforts or thoughts. I take it you were part of the growing effort among the right, hopefully part of the left too, because it's going to take all of us to try to make Congress great again, to get Congress to reassert its natural role in the constitutional system. And I'm just curious about this. I heard Paul Ryan, a former congressman, who was talking on, I think it was, if I remember correctly, he was being interviewed by Steve Hayes of the Dispatch. Could have that wrong. But he was being asked about this old era, because back in the day, I was a big fan of Senator Tom Coburn. I'm from Oklahoma. I was a Coburnite. I still am. I mean, the guy passed away, but I liked his style in the Senate. He railed against pork barrel spending. He railed against earmarking, right? And he would consistently produce these documents about the millions and billions spent just so some congressman could get the library in the backyard with his name so that he could go to his constituents and say, hey, look what I got for you. Send me back to Washington. Nothing so ham-fisted, but that was sort of it was kind of the pay-to-play scheme of our day, if you will, not that long ago. Now, Washington has made some strides in reforming that system. I'm not saying it's perfect or that we haven't seen some chinks in that. And while I am a huge fan of Tom Coburn, I am kind of curious, were he alive today, what would he say about this? Because it seems like some of the unintended consequences of reforming earmarking is that you had taken away the tools that Congress had to kind of get members in line, to negotiate across party lines, to actually build consensus around certain issues. It greased the wheels, if you will. It got legislation that was binding and lasting, and we could get enough votes to actually make changes that largely could benefit the United States through. I'm getting way off because I started off by mentioning Paul Ryan. He had made a statement to the effect of, I don't know that if you just reverse that, it would fix anything. So I think the incentive structures for congressmen now is not necessarily, hey, I got that library built with my name on it. It seems far more, I don't necessarily want to say ideological because our ideologies are so watered down these days, but more a purity test of red versus blue, of fighting the culture war, of convincing your constituents you are on the side of right and against all that's wrong, and that you accomplish this through social media clips, through, Senator such and so yells at Senator such and so in this hearing that goes viral on YouTube or something to that effect. So I'm saying all this to say, what do we do to reform Congress? Like, how do we actually, and I don't think that there's an answer, this is what's going to happen in 2026, but what are the first steps and the building blocks necessary to turn this around, to give Congress what it needs to negotiate across the divide and to reassert its place at the center of our government?
So this actually ties in really well, both with the focus of the Competitive Enterprise Institute, which is specifically deregulation, and then more broadly free markets. Ties in with that. It ties in with the civil service we've been talking about. So what we've seen throughout this time is that the growth of the bureaucracy under Wilson, FDR, and beyond that has actually in some ways been really good for politicians in Congress, because they get to pass these very vague laws, pass them off, and then these bureaucracies get to fill in all the gaps, and they get to run all the stuff rather than Congress being responsible. So if something goes wrong with those regulations and Congress and people don't like it, Congress can just say, well, it wasn't my fault. I didn't do that. And it's true. They didn't do that. The bureaucracy that is kind of unaccountable did that. And so part of what we can do is really just to peel back those regulations, to reform civil service and reform those bureaucracies to where they have less power. And that just inevitably puts power back in the hands of Congress. Now, that can't be the solution in and of itself, because Congress has to actually be willing to take power back as well. It might just end up in the hands of the president otherwise.
Right.
And that's not the system that our government is built to be. We are not a all-powerful executive, whether they're handing that off to agencies under them or not. We are meant to have three branches, and the Congress is one that in particular has been giving away their power a little bit too much in the past several decades. So bureaucratic reform is part of that solution, but you also need to be able to get them to be willing to reset back to what they were meant to be. Now, some of my colleagues here at CEI might have more ideas in mind for what that could look like. I don't have any off the top of my head, but that's kind of the broad strokes that come to mind for me.
Yeah, I'm not asking you to solve one of the most complicated political issues of our time. The last 2 minutes we have on the show, I do think part of a step in the right direction. We probably need some shorthand. One of the things Trump is good at is coming up with those, MAGA, for instance, that we know what we mean. We say "Make America Great Again." That fits on a bumper sticker, right? I don't know, MICGA, like "Make Congress Great Again" or something. There's got to be something in there we could work with that just immediately identifies one as this is what we're aiming for. But we'll work on that. At any rate, Destry, it has been a long 7 years, but it has been great to have you back again. It's good that you're still there in D.C. doing all this work. Like I said, behind the scenes, people have got to do it, and we're grateful for, we've all got our part, and I'm grateful you're playing the role you are. Thank you for taking the time to come back on the Saving Elephants show.
Yeah, glad to be here. For people interested in watching the documentary, it'll be available starting on May 7th on the streaming platform Salem Now. You can either subscribe there or you can rent it from there. And then we'll be expanding to some more places you can see it as the year goes on. It'll also be at some festivals, and we'll be doing some touring. If you actually would be interested in helping us do a screening on tour, you can reach out to us at dmp for Dear Mr. President, DMP at CEI.org. Happy to talk to you there. But yeah, Josh, thanks for having me back on. It's been a lot has happened in this past 7 years, but glad you're still doing what you're doing.
Thanks for listening to the Saving Elephants podcast. Be sure and subscribe for future episodes. Do you have a topic or question about conservatism, millennials, the Republican Party, or anything else that you'd like us to cover in a future podcast? We would love to hear from you. Email us at savingelefantsblog@gmail.com. That is savingelefantsblog@gmail.com. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and catch our weekly Friday blog posts at savingelefantsblog.com. That is savingelefantsblog.com. Join us next time as we reignite conservatism for millennials.